Welcome one and all to the review on the different components for the graphs of trig functions, specifically sine and cosine. Here are the standard forms for the sine and cosine functions. Notice that they are identical except for the fact that one is sine and one is cosine, and they both share the same components where a is the amplitude, b is the frequency, which affects the period length. We'll get into that later. H is the horizontal shift, which is left or right, and k is the vertical shift up and down, which is also the midline. Here's the basic graph of the sine function, where y equals sine x. If you were to write in standard form, here it is, where all the a's in a, b, h, and k can be represented by 1 and zeros. The domain is easy to remember. It is always all reals with the sine function. You go forever to the left, and you go forever to the right. As for the range, simply just put, for the graph, find the lowest point and the highest point of the graph, and that's your range. Cosine is no different except for where it starts in the graph, so it makes a different shape if you do one complete cycle. Standard form is at the bottom, and the domain and range is pretty much identical for the basic cosine function as compared to the basic sine function. So domain is all reals, and range again is from lowest to highest. Midline is where we want to start from. It is the easiest thing to identify because it is literally the horizontal line that is halfway between the max and min values. Remember that the midline is always y equals whatever that number may be. So if you are given a graph, just try to find the halfway point horizontally, and wherever that is on the y, it is y equals that number. So for example here, y equals 0, so you put 0 at the end. So do not just write the number, it is y equals whatever that number may be. The vertical shift is literally tied to the midline because what it does is, if you know what the midline is, it tells you how the graph moves up or down. So positive is up, negative is down. So in this example, the graph did not shift up or down, it is neutral. Amplitude is the distance from the midline to the max value or to the minimum value. Just remember that the amplitude is always a positive value. So the amplitude again is the distance from the mid to the max or to the min. It's the same distance. So in this example, it is just 1. Now we talked about range earlier, but here's a formula to easily identify with what we just talked about. So if you know the midline and the amplitude to the graph, you can find the range just by simply taking the midline and then adding your amplitude to get the max or subtracting your amplitude to get the minimum. So you can do that without the graph as long as you know what the midline and the amplitude are. So an example right here, the max is 1 because the midline was 0, amplitude was 1. So you add 1 to get a max of 1, and you subtract 1 to get the min of negative 1. The period is the length of the cycle. So in other words, start at the origin on the y-axis, and you should draw the line, or you should shade the line until you get one complete cycle before it starts repeating again. And in this example, this ends at 2 pi, so our period is 2 pi. It is easy to remember that the period has 5 key points. Okay. Now, if you are given an equation but no graph, to find the period, you just have to identify the frequency, which is the b right here, and you'd say 2 pi divided by b gives you the period. Now, if you want to find the frequency itself, if you want to find b, and you know the period, and still no graph, you can say 2 pi divided by the period, and that also gives you the frequency. So 2 pi divided by one of them gives you the other. Now this is a nice little thing to help you with when it comes to graphing the sine or cosine functions. Remember that the period again consists of 5 key points, and what you could do is if you know the period, then you can divide it by 4 to find the interval, and then you can use the interval to get all the different pieces within that one cycle, that one period. So in this example, if the period itself is 2 pi, divide that by 4, you get simplified that to pi over 2, and you just add pi over 2 each time to get to the next one. Now the phase shift is the only one that won't be used for this particular week when it comes to the practice. However, it's still good to know how to identify it. So again, phase shift is how the graph moves left or right. It is a little bit harder to determine the phase shift and determine the difference between sine and cosine. So the main focus is on the equations. So make sure you remember that if you do have x being added or subtracted by a number inside a group, then that is the phase shift. If it's not inside parentheses and it's plus or minus, then that's k. and that means up or down, or the midline. Now, to re-emphasize the patterns for sine function versus cosine function is that sine typically starts in the middle of the graph itself, like it starts mid or at the x value of 0, and then that's one of your key points. Then it goes up to 1 or the high, back to the mid of 0, down low to -1, and back to mid 0. And this is where our period would end at 2 pi before it repeats the sequence again. So that's a good way to recognize the graph, whether it's sine. And here's the graph for cosine. Notice that this one kind of makes a U-shaped versus like a sideways S. So you start high at the y value 1, then you go down to 0, which is the mid, low at -1, mid 0, and then back to high of 1. So that right there is a summary of all the different components to the sine and cosine graphs. Make sure to have a clear idea of each part so that now you can know how to combine them all together to either identify the equation or identify the graph given one or the other.